Welcome to Arts, Work, Life, a podcast from the Association of Performing Arts Professionals. I'm your host, Claire Caulfield, and this season, we're doing things a little differently. If you're listening on your favorite podcast app, that is of course great, but this year we have a video component. So hop on over to APAP's YouTube channel if you'd like to watch this episode. So I'd like to introduce someone very important, Jenny Thomas, our executive producer.
Hi, Claire. I'm so happy to be here. And for this 5th season, we're going to be revisiting stories from the last 4 seasons of the podcast.
That's right. And we'll also share what hit for us and for so many of our listeners. I mean, so much has happened since we started this podcast in 2022. Our stories have covered a lot of ground. So this season, we're highlighting 24 stories, which really is just scratching the surface. And we really hope it's going to inspire you to take a trip down memory lane and listen back to all 84 stories. And this first episode of season 5, we are calling Origin Stories. And we're starting at the very beginning of Art's Work Life.
That's right, Claire. This episode truly is a time capsule of where we were in 2022. And we want to dive into why we started the podcast in the first place. I mean, there was a lot going on in 2022, or I should say for the arts world, there was a lot not going on in 2022 with the pandemic, with the call for racial reckoning, the Great Resignation. Those of us working in the arts had to rethink everything.
Yeah, and we're starting today with Tony Lopresti, who is someone who did have to rethink absolutely everything. He's a mime who contracted COVID very early on in the pandemic, before doctors knew much about the disease. Tony's story is one of my favorites, not just because it was like beyond cool to say that I interviewed a mime on a podcast, love that, but really because of how he's just so eloquent, and he had this beautiful description of a spiritual element of sickness that I think often goes overlooked.
And I think you'll hear that in his voice in the story. Again, remarkable that someone who does physical theater and doesn't usually speak, that he really speaks for the field in this story. He really captures the emotion of going through the pandemic, and you can feel the weight of COVID and what it is to be an arts worker during this shutdown.
And here's Tony.
I'm a silent actor, otherwise known as a mime. A lot of people don't understand, think it's kind of silly or frivolous. It's somebody who gets stuck behind a box. But that's not mime itself. Mime is a theatrical art form that can encompass anything that any spoken art form can do. It can do anything. It does it a little bit more compactly, kind of like a poem as opposed to an essay. We harness silence to express those impressions that we can't necessarily put voice to, put words to. The highlight of the year for me is the Festival Musica Soll'Acqua in Italy on the shores of Lake Como. I'm the mime director of the festival. That was just always wonderful. And in 2020, of course, we couldn't do that. Nobody could do anything. But in an immense act of hope, the festival started planning for the summer of 2021, not knowing whether the health officials would allow it and then change their minds and not allow it. Nobody knew. I have 2 friends who are doctors in Milan. They said the situation now actually has changed dramatically, and it's not unlike being in New York. So if I could handle some degree of risk in New York, I should be able to handle some degree of risk in the Lake Como area of Italy. I had such a strong desire not to go. Every year, my strong desire was to go. I was stunned. It's like, I don't want to go? I mean, silent acting's been my passion for my entire life. And suddenly I felt like it wasn't there anymore. I had this fear that COVID had spared my body, but maybe not my soul. It was really hard for me to make the decision to actually go to the festival. And I pushed the decision up to the very last day. I took a deep breath and plunged in, sent them an email, said I was coming. Everything was different. Nothing was the same. And this is Italy. You see a friend and you're going to have a big hug, you're going to kiss people on both cheeks. And it was like, everybody kind of kept a little bit of a distance. And it was like, oh, that's right. That's what is making this so different. I was worried that I would catch COVID again, and I didn't know what that would mean. Would it kill me this time? The trepidation of, can I still do this? What do I have to do to keep going? How can I remain an artist in the face of all of this, in the face of all the suffering that so many have endured? That was the question that was always in the back of my mind. Everything that I did, it was really hard and really scary. I felt like I was going to throw up every day. One of the two pieces of music that I had to choreograph turned out to be really, really difficult for me. I was having profound problems envisioning anything for it. I was like, oh God, what am I going to do? About a week before the concert date, I woke up one morning and just started typing. And I typed for an hour. I wasn't really aware of what was coming out. When I got to the end, it was the full choreography. I was kind of stunned. So I took it to the rehearsal that day. The cast picked it up immediately, almost like they'd been working on it for weeks. And it was like surreal. The whole experience that day was surreal. And the audience was truly appreciative. Very, very warm reception from the audience. I'm left with something different than what I would have thought. I would have thought that maybe, this choreography comes out of the blue, rescues me, rescues the cast, rescues the concert. That to some degree that would be triumphant. And on one level, I was waiting to feel triumphant, but I didn't. The surrounding atmosphere of potential death it really tempers anything that you would call triumph. And I don't think we understand what this is really all about as a globe. I don't think we really get it. Oh yeah, we can open hotels and everybody can fly and everybody can do this and everybody can do that, and people start to wear masks and blah, 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 all that kind of stuff. It's not over. It's not over by any means. Not only just on a physical level, we have no idea how the infection has impacted our souls. That is a call for more silence. Silence can free you from the noise of life, but it also enters into the profound suffering of life. Silence, I think, is the best way to present suffering. And I think if you can touch people's hearts with a physical, silent rendering of what people are experiencing, and perhaps provide in some way a small sign of hope, I think that's healing.
Oh, gosh, Tony, the long COVID effect on our body, our souls, and the arts field was so poignant and so top of mind when I interviewed him. But I think it's really amazing. I never would have thought that those questions would still be so present 4 years later.
Right. And we're not out of the woods yet. I heard recently somebody call where we are right now as long post-COVID.
Interesting.
So, as Tony says, we have no idea how the infection has impacted our souls. That rings so true.
Absolutely. And we actually recently received an update from Tony. So here is Tony in 2026.
Well, it seems for me that the pandemic never left. I contracted COVID again while I was in Italy working on a project, and it left me with long COVID. For about a year after the onset of that, basically that year was coordinating doctor visits to kind of try to find a way to be able to manage this particular COVID complication, let's put it that way. What I learned from the first time was that I was capable of overcoming this, but this was a little different and a little bit more intense. It's taken quite a few years, but I am about 95% back to where I was. I'm good as long as I'm working, as long as I'm moving, as long as I'm exercising, as long as I'm choreographing or performing. So thank God for the work. And it was the work that saved me. It really was, and it continues to be. The projects that I've been involved in have been profound. I've been able to deepen the work, and also to deepen my understanding of being a human being who is not invulnerable, not immortal. All that has come together for me to make my dealings with other people, with other artists, not just profound, but a lot gentler. I feel that I've always had a lot of patience, but I feel like I'm even more patient, I'm more open, I'm more giving, because I've understood, not just in myself, but in many of the people I've met on this particular journey who've been suffering even more than anything I ever went through. And that the art that I do and the art that we all do really is about being compassionate, opening our hearts to share our sufferings, not for our own sake, but for our collective sake. To recognize that we're all on some level suffering, and that the art that we make is to bring that collective suffering to a point where it can be transformed to joy.
And speaking of joy, our next storyteller is Lynne Jordan, who was featured in that very first episode of Arts, Work, Life. Lynne is a staple of the Chicago blues and jazz scene, known for her voice and on-stage charisma.
And we decided to replay Lynne's story because the shutdown exposed a lot of inequities and lack of accessibility. And at the same time, her story reveals new ways of coping that helped shape the way forward.
Lynne starts her story in 2019 when she was visiting a new venue for the first time. Here's Lynne.
And so I'm really excited to go, and I walk in and I see from the entrance the stage at the other end of the room. It's just one big room. It's not anything major. It's just a platform. And as I go and take my seat, I realize that the entrance to the stage is from the audience, and there are 3 freestanding stairs. So there's no railing, there's nothing. There's just 3 little stairs up to the stage, and the room is filling up, and my excitement basically turned to dread because I knew that the audience would have to watch me from the back try and navigate these stairs, and it ain't gonna be pretty. I've been singing for, I don't even know how many years, well, professionally for 30 years, but I didn't have this mobility issue until maybe the last 10 years, I'd say. Up until my arthritis took over my life, I was a very active singer. I danced, but I have osteoarthritis. So it's degenerative and it just gets worse. I started doing things to help strengthen my quads above my knee and lose a little weight. I'm heavy. I'm obese, but what I really need is a knee replacement. What? And so it's what I deal with now. I walk with a cane all the time now. I can list all the venues in Chicago that don't have wings or a backstage area. Because like a lot of blues clubs and just clubs in general, they have a raised stage, they have steps, and it's right in front. And none of them, I can name the ones, there's two, have handrails. They're just free floating stairs. And usually they're like real cheaply made. They just like push them up to the stage. So not only am I having to walk up these stairs with no rails, they're like not connected to the stage. It's the worst. It seems like they don't think that they have performers who will need accessibility. I think they should think about that, especially these blues clubs where a lot of these great living legends are 80 years old, I think they would think of that because it's embarrassing, and it's painful. And if you have any sense of pride, I mean, if I were younger or if I was still dependent on club work for money, it would be awful. But again, it does affect me because my wedding work, I used to do a lot of weddings. I'm a good entertainer, but I can't stand up for very long. So I have to entertain from a chair, a higher chair, kind of cabaret style. But no young kid wants some old woman sitting in a chair. Maybe this is all in my head. But so it has definitely affected that kind of work. But a few years ago, I remember I was sitting at I don't know if it was a wedding or what, and these girls came up. They're like, stand up, get up. And I was like, what in the heck? I can't believe these women are shouting at me to get out of my chair and stand up to sing. But I felt terrible. I wanted to punch them in the head, but I felt horrible. I was like, oh God, this is a nightmare. Get up, dance. And I'm thinking, oh, shut up. I'm disabled. Leave me alone. So I have a very good friend who also has mobility issues. She just doesn't perform anymore because it's just too hard. And I completely get that. But she also has insurance, health insurance, and a retirement. And I don't have all that. So I cannot afford to stop working, If I stopped performing, I'd have to go get a day job. I have a college education and everything, but last time I ever worked was right after college because I started singing, so I didn't have a corporate gig. I would tell any young person to prepare. I'm not saying have a backup career or anything like that, but to have security. I had about a decade of profitable, flourishing life and income. I do wish I had prepared for retirement and wish I had saved my money. When live performing and all my gigs completely canceled because of the pandemic, I pivoted and I bought a external microphone and real fancy iPhone, and I started doing these things called divagrams.
Hey Annie, this birthday divagram is from Kay.
I would sing a song for someone, do a personalized greeting.
She wishes she could be with you on this momentous occasion.
It was all shot waist up, or actually more like the boobs up. And I would put on these bright purple gloves and a hat. And, from the waist up, I was Beyonce dancing in the chair. So I was just hustling right along, doing the virtual work. And no one could see that I needed a cane and I didn't have to go anywhere. Then, of course, things started opening up and live performances came back. And now I'm outed because over the last 2 years, I gained weight. So my knees were hurting even worse. And that was like my biggest dread. I thought, oh my God, what kind of shows am I going to book? I thought, oh God, I wasted those 2 years. Something a friend said to me sticks in my head. I was whining about my knees hurting and not being able to stand. And she said to me, honey, they're paying money to hear you sing, not paying to see you stand. And I thought, yeah. because I've spent enough time beating myself up.
If I ain't solid, I'm gonna sit down on it.
This is who I am. I walk with a cane. I have bad knees, but I'm still a great singer, and I'm going to entertain your patootie off,
Leave it the highway.
Jenny, what else does Lynne's story touch on that is important and is maybe under discussed?
Yeah, Claire, the pandemic really allowed us to think more about accessibility issues that had previously been invisible. And so what I love about Lynne's story is that she is completely honest and out there about the realities of being a performer who has mobility issues. Mm-hmm. And at the same time, it's a very light story that also shows the bits of joy that she found during the pandemic and how she was still able to perform despite her challenges.
Yeah, and that silver lining aspect I think is so important to think about. I just love the music in the piece. Her songs are always stuck in my head in the best way possible. And another thing that's so important about Lynne's story is the advice that she gives to younger performers to plan and prepare for the future. It's a really great message. It's excellent that she was able to pivot to her divagrams during the pandemic, but she talks about how it's important to have a plan. And our next story is about another arts worker who leaned into a different line of work during the pandemic, Anthony Torres. In 2019, Anthony was working on a play about war trauma. The piece was written and performed by Anthony and other Puerto Rican combat veterans. The last live performance was in January 2020, before the pandemic shut down the rest of their tour. So Anthony picks up his story in the summer of 2020, where he was working as a trauma therapist at a rehab facility serving first responders. His story is about the similarities between these two jobs: workshops with veterans and refugees, sharing trauma, theater in the round, group therapy with police officers, sharing trauma, plastic chairs in a circle. But that clinical setting surprised him and had him going around in circles, or maybe more of a spiral, and it forced him to reevaluate what rooms he was creating and why. Here's Anthony.
I began this job as a trauma therapist, working with police officers, firefighters, 911 operators, EMTs, many of them veterans themselves with war experience. I felt like I was a good fit for this job. Combat veteran myself, someone who's been both in the VA and the military. I was in a good position to share with a lot of these folks who also struggle with that dynamic of a readjustment and reintegration into society. George Floyd's murder happened while I was in this job, and I remember walking into my workspace for a 9 a.m. group the very next morning and being one of maybe 3 people of color in this space of 20 or so first responders. In a room full of first responders, how could we not discuss this issue, right? There were 2 African-American police officers who shared, and then things quickly went left. A lot of defensiveness. And I quickly realized that this was not a productive conversation. I was immediately pulled aside by my supervisor, who asked me to basically not do that anymore. And what I did repeatedly during these, 18 or so months at this job was just point out the idea that coming together and having these discussions can be very uncomfortable for many of us for different reasons, but they're vital. When we stop those opportunities, I think we're doing us all a disjustice. And what I saw so often was suffering in the voices, in the eyes, and in the stories of these men and women in these positions. What's frankly scared me was to see these people from all over the country at these seemingly breaking points. My clinical opinion is some of these men and women were not stable emotionally, mentally, to be in these positions of high responsibility, the highest level of responsibility. But there were several instances where it started to just wear on me emotionally. I mean, one example was this police officer who, what was going on in maybe Portland or Seattle, these responses to police brutality, he called these folks savages. That hit so deep with me because that's one of the easiest ways to dehumanize people is to give them this blanket label as you would animals. This was a view that was spoken about Puerto Ricans as Puerto Rico became a colony of the United States. This is also deeply ingrained in the military culture. This is what we do to the others to make us easier to fight them, to hurt them, to kill them. So to hear, this come from a police officer was demoralizing and sad. After talking to a Black detective who said she not only deals with discrimination from her superiors, but also on the job, specifically white men, the disrespect was exhausting. And she shared with me, do you think I'm going to open up and speak about those experiences to a room full of white men? I don't feel comfortable. And I had to do something about that. It really disturbed me. So I decided to have a luncheon. It doesn't disrupt anyone's schedule. Let's just invite anyone who wants to be in the space. And we just had a discussion about what's the impact as a person of color in these environments, in these institutions. And the next day, my supervisor told me that it come down from the chain of command that I would need to not create this kind of special space. And it was very demoralizing for me because I just felt like we're doing the politically correct thing. We're doing the bureaucratic thing. We're clearly not doing the right thing here. So it was a major moral and ethical dilemma for me because on one hand, as a combat veteran myself, to support those who have dealt with trauma, who hold such high responsibility in our society, and understand that they're suffering, but also in their place of authority with the constant threat of violence that they themselves perpetuate, just got harder as it went along. And I had just come from touring throughout 2019 with this piece about war trauma, talking and thinking and writing and, about activism and social justice and raising voices of the marginalized, to do a complete shift from that to I just couldn't help but feel like I was in the wrong place. This is not where I wanted to put my energy. Theater work has always been a platform from day one to address many of these issues of isolation, of loneliness, of suffering, of mental illness. That we have a place, that our stories matter, and our voices, this idea of courage is speaking up despite fear.
So Jenny, we didn't talk about it in the setup, but why did we choose to highlight Anthony's story in 2026?
Absolutely. Anthony's piece really captures the way that the arts open up the capacity for people to feel and have empathy, the way that he talks about his mixed life of being a theater producer and artist himself, and also someone working in trauma care. And so it really connects the dots between arts and mental health. And, he expressly talks about arts as a vehicle for people to share their stories.
Yeah, so there's this quote from him that I just love. Let me read it out here. We have a place and our stories matter. Courage is speaking up despite fear. And that quote has been such a guiding light for the podcast overall. I actually think Anthony was one of the first, if not the first storyteller I ever interviewed for this show.
Wow.
And Yeah, and that quote has, like, thank goodness he was one of the first, because that quote has been in the back of my mind for literally every story that we've ever had on the show. And it's really helped me talk to the storytellers and guide them to that place of courage. So shout out to Anthony.
That's it. That's a real inspiration. He has been the guiding light for our podcast.
Absolutely. Yeah. And another storyteller that has been part of this podcast every single episode. And our final storyteller for today is Carolyn Van Brunt. Even if you didn't listen to her story in season 1, episode 5, like I said, you've heard Carolyn's voice because this little clip plays at the end of every single episode.
So that's why I'm extremely honored to be involved in this podcast. And yeah, arts, work, life. That's real. Well, I just gave you that little tidbit for you to do what you want.
I just love that. I just love that. Her voice is forever burned in my brain.
Absolutely. And that was such a magical moment. And I swear I did not prompt her to do that and not ask her to say the name of the show. I had just asked her to reflect on what themes were in her story. This is something I do with pretty much every storyteller. And that's what she listed off, arts, work, life. And we paused and both just like burst out laughing because that's the name of the show. And I was like, we have to include this in every episode.
It's fantastic. We wanted to revisit Carolyn's story because she works behind the scenes. And in 2020, she was the vice president of guest relations and ADA compliance for the Music Center in Los Angeles County. And her story is so relatable to a breadth of arts administrators, decision makers, and all the people who work in the arts.
Yeah, it's really important to have that behind the scenes perspective. And so here's Carolyn with the story of how the events of 2020 changed her entire approach to the arts workplace.
When I got the notice that we were actually going to shut down, it was not a pleasant time. It was a scary time for us all. But there came a moment when we had to announce to these 400 ushers and all of the guest services staff who were not only co-workers or direct reports, many of them were longtime friends. And all of a sudden, it was time for them to go because furloughs had been enacted. And we had to do this over a Zoom call because everybody was at home at that point. And I was not the host of the meeting, which I would have preferred probably because that seemed a little more personal to me. But our human resources director was the one who had to give this instruction. And so I wanted to appear professional and unemotional about this all. But inside, I was just a wreck. I was nervous. My hands were sweaty. I didn't want them to think I had anything to do with them being furloughed. But I did. I just couldn't even speak until the very end of the Zoom call. And at that point, I offered what I felt was a very weak, lame-ass apology that they had to apply for unemployment. That was bad enough, especially given that I had spent years telling my employees and feeling myself that they were essential because the arts are essential. But suddenly, in this circumstance, you are non-essential workers. How could we be in guest services when there were no guests? I mean, that made sense, just didn't feel good. Didn't feel good at all. And looking at their faces, I don't know, just broke my heart. Really, it just broke my heart. Then came the guilt of surviving. Why survivor's guilt? Because I did not get furloughed. I did take a pay cut, but it's not the same. I still was deemed essential, although I didn't feel it because I felt like, how can I be essential if the people who support me and who are the foundation of my successes are not essential? It just didn't make sense to me at all. So, sitting at home, I'm feeling sadness and I'm feeling guilt. And then I'm watching a lot of TV because what else is there to do? And I'm watching over and over and over again the footage of the murder of George Floyd. And watching this horrific murder just brought about anger and frustration on top of all of this pandemic stuff. I mean, here we go. And it just got to be too much for me. But I had to push those feelings down because I couldn't be the angry Black woman. I had to push down my feelings, continue to participate in conversations at my job about diversity and equity and inclusion and moving toward a non-racist society and all of that. But I didn't feel that that was really authentic. I didn't feel that I could be my authentic self or express my true feelings because it wasn't professional or because it would make waves, especially given that I, at that particular time, was the only African-American woman in an executive position. And that put me in a very strange circumstance because I wanted to speak as a Black person. I wanted to speak as a professional. However, I had to balance who I am as a person and who I am in my position. So that was really hard. I found myself, although deeply involved in discussing the culture of my workplace and our response to the Black Lives Matter movement, all of a sudden we were in a debate about all lives matter. Some of our meetings, I could hardly resist busting in there with some of my choice words to express my frustration, but I shut up because I knew no good could come of that. Again, the angry Black woman is not welcome in those environments. And I thought, I've had enough. I've just had enough. I need to express my anger, my anxiety. I need to find an outlet. So I picked up a pen and a notebook and I started. I didn't even want to put it on the computer. I wanted to feel it come through my fingers. I even put a couple of curse words in there because I felt that that would express the depth of my emotion. So finally, letting out the sadness and the guilt and the anger, I came up with a poem that I just entitled To Whom It May Concern, because I wondered who is concerned about all this stuff that's going on in the world? Who really cares about this like I do?
To Whom It May Concern by Carolyn van Brunt, August 2020. These times, oh yes, they are a-changin'. Can't go to school or church, we all in danger. Careers in question, furloughs all around, survivor's guilt and sadness abounds. Sick and tired of being sick and tired, still the last hired, still the first fired. It matters not that we're the foundation, our blood, sweat, and tears help to build this nation. Racism rampant enough.
So even though I was a little nervous about it, because again, I'm protecting my professional reputation and all that, I decided I'm going to post this. I don't care. I'm going to put it on any platform that I think will get an audience because I want people to know how I felt. So I put it online and I started getting very, very positive feedback from my friends, from strangers, whoever read the writing. And I was very much encouraged that I was not alone. There were many, many people feeling the sense of loss, the anger, and the frustration, even the helplessness of it all. And I think that was really cathartic. It was cathartic. I know it was. For them and for me. Now I believe that my authentic self is essential. That's my takeaway from it all. The arts are transformative. It can take your feelings and turn them right upside down and make yourself feel essential, important, validated. And I believe that we need to build in all arts workplaces the support that people need to be their authentic selves in their workplace, in their creative expression, and in their everyday lives.
What really stays with me about Carolyn's story is the political tension during this time and how she reacted to it. Just like we heard in Anthony's story, Carolyn highlights the tension around the racial reckoning that was just so present in 2020. Jenny, I'd love to hear your perspective as an arts worker yourself, working behind the scenes. What sticks with you about Carolyn's story?
Yeah, Claire, you really feel Carolyn's survivor's guilt throughout the story. Not only that she kept her job, but that she was in the room when so many lost their jobs.
Yeah, it's such an impactful story. And, revisiting all these stories, sometimes 4 years later, 3 years later, even a year later has been such a gift because in hindsight, you really see how present some of these problems are, but also feel some gratitude that things are changing for the better in the industry. I'm so glad that we're taking time this season to reflect and giving these storytellers another chance to shine. And also, selfishly, it's been so nice to have a co-host. Usually it's a little lonely producing things. So, Jenny, thank you so much for coming along on this ride.
Of course, Claire. Let's do it again.
We are going to do it again because next time on Arts Work Life, we revisit 4 stories about the journeys we take as arts workers.
Thanks for joining us.
Arts Work Life is a production from APAP, the Association of Performing Arts Professionals. The opinions expressed in this podcast are those of the storytellers and not necessarily those of APAP. APAP is the national service organization for the performing arts presenting, booking, and touring industry. You can join APAP at apap365.org. I'm Claire Caulfield, your host and producer. Jenny Thomas is our amazing executive producer and co-host. And as always, we want to give a thank you to Grace Asuncion. Music today was from Blue Dot Sessions and Lynne Jordan. This podcast wouldn't be possible without the generous support of the Wallace Foundation. So thank you. Other thank yous to the APAP staff and board of directors, and of course, our storytellers and the hundreds of thousands of arts workers across the world. Your stories matter, and arts workers are essential. If you enjoyed this episode, and we really hope you did, why not send the link to someone who helped you get through 2020? And if you're watching on YouTube, be sure to like and subscribe.
Arts, work, life. That's real.